Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
I'd like to read to you part of a Walt Whitman poem. For those that don't know, he was an American poet. He lived from 1819 to 1892. Now, the reason that those dates are important is that he experienced America at its most bitter divide during the period leading up to the Civil War, the war itself, and then the Reconstruction. And one of the things that I admire about Walt Whitman is, at least in his poetry, he remained hopeful, just like Aidan was saying earlier. He continued to believe in American ideals and the American spirit, and he felt that it would transcend this difficult moment in our nation's history. This poem is called A Runaway Slave. A runaway slave came to my house and stopped outside. I heard his motions crackling the twigs of the woodpile. Through the swung half door of the kitchen, I saw him, limp and weak, and went where he sat on a log and let him in and assured him, and brought water and filled a tub for his sweated body and bruised feet, and gave him a room that entered from my own, and gave him some coarse, clean clothes, and remember perfectly well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness, and remember putting plasters on the galls of his neck and ankles. He stayed with me a week before he was recuperated and passed north. I had him sit next to me at table. My file lock gleamed in the corner. I'll share with you what's compelling to me about this poem. First is its simplicity. Often in poetry, the writer uses literary techniques to elicit emotion or help us paint a picture. But here, Whitman has chosen not to use a lot of alliteration or metaphor. Its simplicity brings forth the human story. It's not dressed up in technique. There's a purity about it. The second thing that strikes me about this poem is its decency. At the time that Whitman experienced a runaway slave coming into his yard, slavery was a very complex issue in which the entire nation was embroiled. It was complex morally, it was complex economically, it was complex politically. But what this poem does is it boils it down to human decency. That an injured human being, frightened and in need of help, appeared before another. And the response was to dress those wounds and provide shelter. The third thing that strikes me about this poem is that it puts a face on a vast array of experiences. At the time that Whitman experienced sheltering a runaway slave, these stories were all over the newspaper, and people would shake their heads and they would feel one way or another about slavery. But what he did with this poem is say, this is an actual person. This is what the experience is really like. So today, I would like to share an experience that I had with you. Because, like Whitman, we live in a divided nation. And there are issues in which we are entangled morally, politically, and economically that we have not figured out how to fix yet. And I am not telling you this story to persuade your politics, but rather to put a human face on a complexity of our situation today, and also to say, what does Judaism have to tell us about this situation? And the bottom line is compassion. No matter how you feel the laws should fall, to feel compassion for the human beings that are caught up in these troubles. I got a phone call a week ago Thursday from a colleague at an organization called Faith in Texas. And he said, "Will you come with us to a deportation hearing?" And I said, I will come, but why is it that you need a rabbi in particular? And he said, well, this woman, her name is Gabriella. This woman, Gabriella, part of why she has this deportation hearing is that she was in possession of a false ID in order to help her seek employment. And her own pastor, because this is a crime, has refused to go with her to the hearing. And we don't think she should be alone in this moment. Will you come? I said, yes. So Friday morning, I went to the deportation center. It's in a nice office building, very close to where 35 meets Mockingbird. And Gabriella was there with part of her family. She was there with her husband, who is also an undocumented immigrant, and she was there with her oldest child, Diana. Diana is DACA, which is a status deferred action for childhood arrivals. So during the Obama administration, there was some thought that if a minor had been brought across the border, we should make a larger effort to help them stay in our country. There are also two younger children who are full citizens. They are in middle school and elementary school, but they were not present. A small film crew helped Gabriella and her family share their story and document this moment. And then we prayed with Gabriella before entering the building. Not all of us went in, her husband included, because of his uncertain status. He was afraid to go in with his wife. And as we entered the building, I asked Gabriella if she knew what her name meant in Hebrew. She did not. And I said, your name means my strength is God. And I said, I am praying for you, Gabriella, that you feel God's strength in this moment. I know it must be very difficult for you. She went in to speak to her caseworker. No one was allowed to accompany her. But I sat with her daughter in the waiting room, and Diana and I got to talking about her life. She wants to be a journalist. She is a sophomore in college. And she was saying, it's challenging now to balance working, because she helps with her income for the family, and being a good student. And she says she imagines her life will become even more challenging once her mother leaves the country, because she will be responsible for her two younger brothers. I asked her when Gabriella would need to leave, and she said, we're afraid that it might be today. But what my mother is going to ask is that she be allowed to remain for 1 month, both so that she can self-deport to a city where she has family and friends, not to be dumped in a border town, and also because my family will need to move. I said, why will your family need to move? Well, we're losing my mother's income, so we can't afford our apartment anymore, so we need some time to find a new place to live that we can pay the rent. And my mother hopes to have a month's time to help us do all of this. Gabriella came out of her meeting. It was about 20 minutes long, and she is going to be deported in a month. But she was told by her caseworker that she has the right to appeal in that time if she would like to do that. We went back downstairs and gathered with the others, and Gabriella shared this news with her husband. And then we asked, are you going to pursue the appeal? She said, yes, I am. We're already working with a lawyer. And one of my colleagues said, and he knows more about the legal side of this than I do, he said, if you don't mind my asking, how much is this lawyer charging you? And she named the sum, and he paused and said, well, I have a colleague who's really excellent at this work that will do it for much, much less money. Would you like me to put you in touch with him? And she said, I would. And then she and her husband started crying, and we surrounded them again and we prayed. So now I know what a deportation feels like. And I guess to some extent, so do all of you. And it's challenging from a Jewish perspective, right? That's the relevant question today. Because on the one hand, there is a halachic principle that says, Dina malchuta dina. The law of the land is the law of the land. It must be respected by the Jewish people. And in her case, there were laws broken. She chose to enter this country and remain in this country without going through our documentation process. And she was in possession of a fake ID, which is a crime. On the other hand, our parsha this week says, "You shall not oppress the stranger among you, for you were strangers in Egypt." So how do we both follow the current laws of our land and refuse to oppress the stranger? How can we do both at the same time? Because our Torah demands that we do both. I can tell you what Temple Emmanuel is doing. Their board has gone through a process to become a sanctuary congregation. Now, in its most extreme, intense form, that would mean someone who has been asked to deport comes to live in your house of worship. Let me be extremely clear, that is not what Temple Emmanuel is doing, and that is not what I am asking us to do. However, their board has gone through a process, their community is going through a process to say, what can we do for the human suffering that results from our current situation? These families are in need sometimes of physicians. Many of them are afraid to seek medical care. These families are in need of social workers to help them find all the resources in our community that can support them. They are in need of psychologists to help these young children process the fact that their parents must leave the country. They are in need of good lawyers, where if there's any way that they can appeal the process, they have legal help to do so. And so Emmanuel has decided they're going to provide these services for the immigrant community of Dallas. They're also providing resources because, as you can imagine, with the loss of one spouse's income, there are needs for clothing, for food, for household items. Those are things that Jewish people can do with compassion, regardless of their political ideology. I can't tell you how many people in the past month have said to me, I don't know the immigration status of the woman who cleans my house. I'm not sure if my gardener is a legal or illegal immigrant, and I'm not sure I want to know. Fair. I think the two interesting things about that statement are we're a part of this entangled political, economic, moral system in our country. Every time we eat in a restaurant or stand in a building that was built, we're a piece of this. Now, that doesn't mean it's upon us to solve it. And I wouldn't ask any of us to turn to our employee and say, would you please tell me your legal status, right? For one thing, how would our employee hear that question? And for another, what would we do with that information? But there is something we can do as individuals. We can say to our employees, I know things are very hard and frightening in the immigrant community right now. And I feel that pain, and I have sympathy for you. I have compassion for you. And then if you feel so moved, you could say, is there anything I can do to help? Or I can help in this specific way. It is within my power to alleviate your suffering. Because the stranger is living among us. And our Torah says we are not allowed to oppress them with indifference or silence or inaction. And like Walt Whitman, I too am hopeful and believe in the American spirit to move through this process, through this moment where illegal immigration is institutionalized, and find a better solution, whatever that looks like. And in that process as a Jew, I will offer my compassion. Shabbat Shalom.